Hey everyone, David Chen here. Moon Knight just finished up a limited season run over on Disney Plus, and I wanted to chat with somebody who is knowledgeable about this character so we could talk about what this character was like in the comics, how they tried to translate that over into the show, and what exactly the show is trying to do. And I found the greatest person for that. That's Dan Gvozden over at the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. Check out his work at amazingspidertalk.com. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. But yeah, we tried to figure out what exactly is going on here and how successful it was. I hope you enjoy the conversation. If you do, be sure to give a like or a subscribe or a bell icon check to this video. But here's my conversation with Dan Gvozden about Moon Knight on Disney Plus. Enjoy. Before we get into all the spoilers around Moon Knight, the TV series on Disney Plus, let's talk a little bit about your relationship to this comic. This is a comic that you are quite familiar with, a character you're quite familiar with. So, what were your expectations before you watched Moon Knight on Disney Plus? Is this something that you had high expectations for, low expectations for? What was kind of your relationship with the character?
It's kind of hard to say. I assume you had no familiarity with this character before this, correct, Dave?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, he is, I don't know if he is like the lowest tier hero that they've adapted to screen thus far. That's not to say he's like a low tier in my heart, because I actually really like this character from the comics, but that's to say like he's never really sustained a long comic run before. Perhaps like I think the most popular version of him was this run with like Warren Ellis and a bunch of different artists, Declan Shavley being one of the artists. And the thing about Moon Knight is, I mean, not only is the whole dissociative identity disorder thing, it's like almost like every writer who takes on the character kind of reinvents the character largely. So, you've got like versions where like Mr. Knight is introduced and he's this kind of like cold, calculating killer. You've got a version from Brian Michael Bendis, the guy that created Miles Morales, where Moon Knight is taking on the identities of different Avengers, and he'll fight with different fighting styles and think he's Captain America, Spider-Man, and Wolverine within the same comic. You've got like just so many different interpretations of the character. My expectations were really, I don't really know where they were, because it could have been handled any number of ways. And the biggest question I had would be really where they kind of dropped the needle, so to speak, and what it landed on and what interpretation of the character we were getting. And there was some nerves going into it, because Mr. Knight, this character, the Steven version of Moon Knight, it was a character that didn't appear for 20, 30 years, maybe in 40 years into the character's existence. And here he was seemingly showing up straight away.
Mr. Knight is the Stephen Grant version of the character, right?
Correct. Yeah.
One of the identities that Oscar Isaac plays. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know amongst like comic fans, they were very nervous about it, because they were like, how are they going to get to that character so immediately?
Not only immediately, he is, arguably the protagonist, like the person who you start the show with, right?
Correct.
So that's interesting. That's interesting. So it sounds like different creators have had different takes on the character, but that there's not that much that has persisted for you beyond the idea that he has dissociative identity disorder, and also the kind of design of the character, right? Like,
yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, the DID wasn't even really a part of the character straight away either. That was added on by another writer down the line, and like some people hand it very differently. Like there's one run where he has a different identity for each phase of the moon. And it's like, oh, that's kind of cool. And, he's one of those characters, I would say, not quite on the level of Daredevil, but like it's often been argued in comics that the best Marvel comics are the ones the editors aren't looking at. And so you can kind of do anything you want. And that's what made Moon Knight so fun, is it was kind of the slightly edgier, darker, more violent book that existed in kind of monster territory at Marvel. And so you could get kind of fun off the wall things you wouldn't see in a Spider-Man comic, which is meant to appeal to a broader, more consistent audience.
Darker, edgy, fun, off the wall, all characteristics I want in my television.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about Moon Knight, the TV series starring Oscar Isaac, which just concluded its first and I believe only season. Um, Dan Gvozden, given your expectations, what did you think of Moon Knight, the TV show?
Well, it's funny because I almost worked on this show to believe it, and I was told the premise before it even was really shot, that it was kind of this like gallivanting adventure in the vein of like National Treasure. And I don't know if that's even an accurate description of this
Mm-hmm.
show. And I was like, well, that's really something I don't associate with Moon Knight. Okay. I guess we'll see what it is. And my expectations, like it really wavered. I thought the first episode was a great deal of fun. It seemed like a much smaller scope of thing, and they were really having fun playing with the different, identities and memory. And I love the conceit of all the reflections and the kind of
Mm.
artistry applied to that. And we got some kind of like teasing cool reveals of the Moon Knight costume and how that all worked. And the more the show went, the less I liked it. I never really got a sense that they knew who Moon Knight was, or
Mm-hmm.
what the concept of their show was, which kind of gets back to my thing about the comics, which is, it varies so wildly. And I feel like in a lot of these Marvel shows and and movies, they kind of, will take stories from all over the place and boil them down into some new essence, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
got Captain America, and, you've got some stories pulled from the 60s, 70s, 80s. Bucky Barnes is in the first Captain America movie, and they're setting up Winter Soldier, but that started like 50, 60 years into Captain America's existence. And normally you can kind of draw like a coherent through line through how these characters are. But with Moon Knight, it almost feels like they read all of the first issues of all the different Moon Knight runs and were
Mm-hmm.
like, that's the character. And
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's read the comics would tell you that's not a character. And the
Mm-hmm.
show felt that way. Like it had dissociative identity disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Cause like
Mm-hmm.
I never could put my finger on like what this show was.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and the more it wavered, the more I like lost interest in what was happening.
Let's talk about some of the great things about this show. Okay. There's a lot of stuff that's worth praising about the show, and I want to make
Totally.
sure before I get into the bulk of my opinion, we talk about the great things about the show. Okay.
Sure.
First of all, I do think it's notable that you know Mohammed Diab directed several of the episodes, and it is a series that does play a lot with Egyptian myth and folk tales and things of that nature. And like it's rare to just see that uh, in pop culture in general, And so
Totally.
it's great to see kind of that type of storytelling told by people who are presumably familiar with it. And it's rare to see, and like I'm glad that to the extent that they tried to honor it, like this is a show that took people to places where they don't usually go when they're watching like an adventure story, both geographically and also metaphysically, right? Oscar Isaac, I thought, was awesome in the show.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he is kind of doing a Tom Hardy in Venom type deal where this script demands that he goes like all over the map when it comes to emotion and intensity, and I do think that he delivers given how challenging uh, it is. And I think overall, like most of the cast is really great. You got F. Murray Abraham as Khonshu. You got Ethan Hawke as Arthur Harrow. You got May Kalamawi as Layla. Like all these people, I think actually do a really great job given the material that they have. I like there's a handful of really amazing visuals. We're
Totally.
spoiling everything in this video, but there's this idea of like turning back the clock on the stars, and like that's just an amazing idea, and it's executed really well in the show, I think. And there's other visuals. Some of the CG is really dodgy, some of it is not. Like some of the CG effects are like really amazing, some of them is like pretty uh pretty sketchy, but there's just a ton of CG in the show to begin with, right? I
Right.
thought like Khonshu as a CG character was really well done overall.
Completely. And
Yeah,
exactly how I have always imagined him, like this creeping figure in the background whose presence is always unsettling. And he could be very silly looking if done incorrectly, but always worked for me.
yeah. There are also some really cool ideas, like when he's flashing between the identities, like and seeing his other identities in the mirror. That was always done at a really high level filmmaking, I thought, right? Um, just like when he's talking to himself in the mirror, or he's talking to, like, when Mark is talking to Steven in the mirror or something like that. It's usually done very artfully. There's like a focus pull or something that makes it feel like these people are living in the same universe. And so visually, and like just that idea, the way that it's executed, I thought was really, really pretty flawless and impressive. So those are all the things that I really liked about Moon Knight. Dan, anything you want to add to that before I talk about what I thought about the show?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I want to really praise the first two episodes of the show, which I think like keep the stakes fairly small and, have some kind of cool designs. Like I love the design of the Moon Knight suit and
Yes,
the
yes,
animations around it.
yeah.
I wish desperately that we got more of it. I don't really know why you do a Moon Knight show and don't feature Moon Knight.
Mm-hmm.
But like all of that was
Moon Knight was in the actual Moon Knight was in a shockingly small percentage of the show, I would say,
right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like there's what, 3 episodes where he doesn't show up at all.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not maybe including the first one where he barely shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And
His presence is implied heavily in the first one, I think, right?
yeah,
But yeah,
absolutely.
I that was another thing I wanted to mention, which is, of all of the Marvel shows, some of which we have recapped episode by episode together on this channel, this is the one that is the most self-contained, right? I would say
Correct.
this
Yeah.
is the one that makes very little reference to any other Marvel stuff. Like, and my guess is other Marvel stuff will depend on it very little, in order to function. And so I really like more self-contained Marvel stuff, right? Like,
Totally.
and I think this show accomplishes that. So
And I think the first two episodes have this kind of like lived in real world quality to them. We see his like apartment and the layout of his apartment and how he chains himself up to the bed
yeah,
at night.
and the sand to indicate whether he's like moved, in his apartment and stuff like that. Yeah,
Right. And the kind of secret compartment up above and his coworkers and his relationship with his job, like, and how the revelations about Mark begins to complicate all of that. I thought that interplay was actually really interesting. I started to lose it. It's funny. I don't think I'm quite as high on the supporting cast as you are, but like the minute his wife showed up, I felt like that world started to disintegrate a little bit.
mm-hmm.
But
If you thought the supporting cast in this show was rough, wait till you see Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Dan.
I
But
have seen it.
yeah, I
But
know.
yeah, I think I spent more time with them here. But and I like some like I think this show had incredible set design throughout. Like
Yes,
there's
in particular the hospital, I thought was just incredible. Like all the white and the props that they used, even the opening sequence with the guy putting the glass in his shoes and everything, like all that stuff.
yeah.
Like the production design, I thought was really impressive overall.
I'm mixed on the hospital for I think the design is like and the construction of it is great.
Yes.
I think narratively it doesn't make a lot of sense the way that it's a split design. It's never convincing you that it feels real and it's never convincing you that it feels like a dream. And
Mm.
and I wish they had kind of chosen one or the other
Mm-hmm.
because it seems like they want
I,
you to believe that it's a real place.
Yeah,
Um,
and you think it's too kind of, if you're designing a hospital, you wouldn't design it like what the hospital looks like in the show, right?
it's
Like
completely arch.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like something that a supervillain's hospital would look like, as opposed to like a supervillain's idea of what a hospital would look like, as
Yeah.
opposed to what a real, actual, practical hospital would look like.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like, where is all this beautiful light coming from? I
Why
mean,
would you have sharp, heavy objects lying around everywhere for patients to grab and threaten you with. It doesn't make any sense.
And this again gets back to my comment about the comics, which was like, there's a whole run of Moon Knight from Jeff Lemire, one of my favorite comic writers from, maybe like 5 or 6 years back, where the number one issue opens and Mark is just in a hospital and is being convinced that Moon Knight was all an imagination. And it's actually very convincing. Like, the work that Jeff Lemire did to write that, like, squares the entire history of Moon Knight as just a figment of Mark's imagination, and how like that world begins to melt and break down. But it always convinces you that the hospital is a real place. And here I never once bought it. So the trick was immediately, evaporated. Yeah.
Let's talk about the reality of what's actually happening here, right? So we're going to spoil everything through Moon Knight. At the end of the day, was it all in his head or not? Like, what is your opinion on that? Because I think the text of the show, until the very silly post-credit stinger, the text of the show is that Moon Knight, Mark Spector, Stephen Grant is like a reality and identity that Mark Spector has conjured up to cope with the tragedy of his life. That's he's kind of like, well, goodbye, doctor, and then he like wakes up in his bed, right? And that's kind of the end of the show. And it's like, oh, like all this stuff was like imaginary, but I'm curious, like, what did you think of it?
I'm going to be honest. I was completely and utterly lost. Like it goes into levels of inception that I didn't know where I was at any given point. Because even in the hospital scenes, there seems to be two separate reality versions of that hospital scene where we're cutting back and forth. And maybe it had to do with the design of the hospital that I never bought it as a real location. So I never believed it as anything real, but we were like in a dream inside of a dream, which was also the Egyptian like realm of the dead. Like it completely lost me about its rules. And it was one of those things where like, we've got our A story, our B story, and then we're all the way into our Z story. And I've forgotten what the stakes of the A story were.
Yeah. It's so true. Yeah.
And this, it's like the Russian nesting doll of storytelling. And by the end of it, I honestly didn't even
another
know
show that will make you question the nature of your reality. Russian doll, by the way.
Sure. Yeah. I'm eagerly awaiting season 2, but
it's already out. But I think you're eagerly awaiting watching it. But you're saying you basically didn't form an opinion on what was real and what was not.
I didn't feel like I had enough information to. I didn't understand the images that were coming at me. I couldn't contextualize what they were meant to mean by that, and maybe I'm bringing some baggage into it because like in the comics have played with this endlessly forever. And that's just kind of part of it, is that you'll never really know, although it much more sides on it being real. Like we just had a whole run in the Avengers comics where Khonshu basically used Mark Spector to fight the Avengers and take over the universe. It was a really dumb story. But so like, I don't think the Avengers are fighting some manifestation of Mark's dissociative identity disorder. And I think even here, I think like with that post-credit scene, like it seems like Khonshu's pretty real. But I don't know.
Well, the thing is, I thought that the way that, so I think many people have said episode 5 is like really, really great. And I would agree that episode 5, entitled Asylum, is in general probably the high point of the show, other than maybe episode 1. I think from my viewing, it seems that it was really important for the creators of the show to depict it in such a way that you could read it in either way, right? You could read it as either this is all part of his imagination, or it's actually real, and maybe there's some kind of ruse to like get him to like be subjugated in some way or something like that. But like, I guess there's 3 realities at that point, right? There's like the, let's say, base reality with like Ethan Harrow trying to release Amit. There is the hospital reality, and then there's the you're dead. You need to balance the scales of before you get to reach the field of reeds, right? Like those
Yeah.
three realities. Um, Although the hospital reality and the field of reeds reality, like the ship reality, kind of blend in together, right? If I recall
Sure.
correctly, like
Yeah.
the hospital is kind of in the ship, as it were. Um, but I actually thought that episode where like he's kind of like snapping between the realities, and he's like looking at like, oh, there's a little Khonshu doll, and here's like where all the stuff from my, like how I invented all this stuff in my head. Um, that was all actually, I thought, really well done. But I would agree with you that when you're dealing with that many layers, it is extremely easy to lose track of. Wait, I don't think the show even comes to a conclusion on what actually is real, because putting aside the post-credit sequence, I actually do think, in my opinion, the most plausible scenario is he invented all this stuff in his head to help him deal with reality. But then you have that post-credit stinger that's like, wait a second, there was some guy named Ethan Harrow whose like body is encased with this whatever, and he's all messed up, and then you need to kill him in order to defeat Amit or whatever. So I think the post credits doesn't jive. It really does just feel like you said, Dan, that they're just throwing a bunch of ideas at the screen. What if it was, um, what if it was a reality he invented? What if it was actually real? What if he's actually trying to like get to the field of reeds with his buddy Stephen Grant? Like, what if? Let's just throw it all in and see if it will work.
Yeah.
And I think it's just too many alternate realities for it to be really satisfying storytelling, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, for me, it comes down to, I know you're saying like episode 5 was a high point. For me, it was a low point. It's where it really lost me, because you have this hospital that's being depicted two ways. Like there's a version of the hospital where it's Mark and Stephen Grant running around it together and finding sarcophagi. And like, clearly that's not real. Or it's the weirdest hospital ever.
And then you have the version of him talking to the doctor, right, in that room.
Right.
And that's like more grounded, right?
That's more grounded, but not even grounded enough for me to buy into it, because like, why does he have all this Egyptian iconography in his office? Why is his psychiatry office, whatever, crumbling around the edges? It's just so ornate. Like I didn't buy into that either. So
but I think what really got to me about that episode is you have Oscar Isaac kind of in these multiple realities. He's like screaming. He's like literally like, get away from me, or what, he's like, and he's screaming, and then it cuts between the two realities, and you see him screaming to this doctor, and the doctor is being like, in general, very professional, like as Ethan Hawke as Dr. Harrow is like very professional and like,
right.
Hey, like, come back to me, Stephen, like he's saying all the things that a understanding doctor would say. And it felt to me like a really sort of, it felt to me like a depiction of what someone actually experiencing this might be going through, right? Like some kind of hallucinations, some kind of dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, whatever you want to call it. But it felt to me like, wow, like you can see the gulf in this episode. You can see the gulf between what their lived experience is and what an outsider's view of that person would be. And I found that to be like pretty powerful. Now, does the show have a lot of interesting stuff to say about mental health? I don't think so, because I think you need to tell a cohesive, satisfying story for that to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the show does that. But it does have these glimpses of like, wow, that's kind of a really powerful moment, a kind of really raw, visceral depiction of what somebody who's like mentally unwell might be going through and how they feel judged by the world. And I thought that was really effective. But
yeah, at the same time, like, I mean, I'd be curious to hear what kind of conversations were had with their, like, if in the credits there's a DID consultant, included. And I'd be very curious to hear what kind of conversations were had, because you end the show with the sort, and there's an implication throughout of this sort of like evil alternate, that shows up at the end, or a more kind of violent alternate.
Yeah.
And I know that that's something in that community that is kind of a stigma that has plagued DID, people who live with that
Yeah.
diagnosis. So I'd be curious.
I think to their credit, I don't know if they use the word DID or they use the phrase dissociative identity
Yeah,
disorder in the
they
show.
never do. Yeah, they never
Right.
do.
Which I actually think is like to their credit, because you don't want people to compare a real life dissociative identity disorder with what you see in the show. And so
Yeah.
they never actually call it that. And I think that's to their credit. Now, in all the reading materials, like on Wikipedia and stuff, that's what they call it. But like, I'm glad they didn't use the actual medical term, because they don't want people conflating the two, right?
Yeah.
But
I'm curious because like episode 5 was the one that really kind of like lost me, like, but you really liked it. So I'm curious where you kind of got lost by the series, because like I'm getting the sense that you're like, look, these some isolated things worked for me, but there were like I didn't really like the show didn't work for me overall, and I'm curious where you got kind of like hung up.
I think Dan Gvozden, you and I have spent, I don't know, dozens of hours, tens of hours recapping Marvel shows at this point.
Sure.
Right? Together.
Yeah.
It's been a wonderful journey.
Look at us, David.
Who'd have thought?
Yeah.
I think I might be done with Marvel TV shows.
Okay.
I think like this is it. This is it for me. And the reason is that Marvel TV shows suffer from some huge problems. One of them I would describe as random stuff happens. Like,
yeah,
a lot of the actions that occur or the events that occur feel either completely unmotivated, or they happen only because the script has deemed that they happen, or they happen and you don't have enough as the audience member to really feel like this is important. So a big example in this show would be the death of Layla's father.
Yes.
Which is a character I don't even think you see on screen. Maybe you see him as like a dead person, but like I don't think you even see him on screen. They made a valiant effort to try to get you to feel something about that character. They had this whole extended opening sequence, I think in episode 3, where Layla talks with that forger about, hey, like, remember my dad and how awesome he was? Like they try to like humanize this character. But like ultimately, like a huge amount of the drama of the show turns on this huge event that happens completely off screen and in the past. Right.
I think you could say the same thing about the origin of the Moon Knight character as well. Right. Like, I mean, this is a thing they've been doing in a lot of these when they introduce a new character, which is start with them kind of fully formed and then kind of expect you just to kind of go on. And I thought that's what we were doing. But then in episode 4, I think we suddenly get the whole origin of Moon Knight, and there's no real sense of like why it's being told in this way, and how one action connects to the consequences of those actions. And like, that's the thing I always struggle. Like, what are the stakes here? You know, and when I do find the stakes, it's like the world is going to be judged, and that doesn't mean anything to me, and so it's like, you're right. Random stuff happens. And I bet you could thread that needle, but it's so much work, like to do so. I never know what I'm tuning in to be excited about.
Yeah. So I do think this show suffers a lot from like random stuff happens. And then I think that all the Marvel shows like end really abruptly. They're just like, they end and it feels like very little is resolved, or very little has occurred, or they're preparing for the next season, or they're preparing for the next movie, or it's just connective tissue for the next movie. And that's certainly the case here. At the end of it, I'm like, what was the point of all that? There's a reading of this show where all this stuff happens in his head, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, like, what was the point of all that? Like, we got to explore this guy's mindset in a not very deep way for reasons I just explained. Like, okay, we're getting back at this, this tragedy of his past is told in a very clunky way. I think, like, with his brother, they went in a cave, his brother drowned, and his mom held it against. It's like, it's very cliche, and it's not like it's not like, and it's okay for it to be cliche. It's not like you need to invent a whole brand
Well,
new
it's just not
trauma.
done with nuance.
Yeah, that's right. It's not done with nuance. It's not done with a particularly large amount of artistry. It's just like his brother died and his mom held it against him. Like that's the whole thing. And it's like, okay, and that caused a fracture. Now, what was cool was, what was interesting was, one thing I found to be satisfying was, I was like, wait, if these guys shared the same body, what was Stephen Grant's history? And then you find out, of course, that Stephen Grant was like an invented character. He
Right.
was not the original. And that was actually kind of cool because the show began with Stephen Grant. So it's
Right.
like, you think he's like the kind of original, like OG copy of this guy. And then you find out, oh no, he's the invented one. That's a cool reversal. I really like that narratively. But aside from that, it's like, okay, we went on a few adventures, but like, at the end of the day, I think so much random stuff happens. Like as an example, another example, like Layla becoming the Egyptian superhero, Scarlet Scarab.
Are
Like
you an Egyptian superhero?
Is she? I think
no,
she is.
I'm making a joke. I thought that
I know.
line was so painful.
It is super. It's like, it's clunky. It's clunky. It's not, and it would actually not be even that clunky if she had more than, I think, basically half an episode to build up to that. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like, if you want this to be the origin story of Scarlet Scarab, like, you only have 6 hours to do that. Like, you need to spend more time than like 20 minutes on it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, that's the thing I don't get is like the Netflix shows we bash for being so long and laborious to get through. And it's like, oh, these shouldn't be 13 episodes. They should be 8 episodes. But now we've settled on 6 episodes and none of these shows felt like they could be contained within 6 episodes. And I don't know why
some people were arguing this should be a movie. And I actually don't disagree, except that you have things like trying to introduce Scarlet Scarab, which is like, I'm okay with that. But like, if that's the case, it needs to be, how like, remember how Black Panther was introduced in Captain America Civil War, I think, right? He just kind of showed up and then like did a action scene. And then I think he was like absent for most of the rest of the movie. Right.
Right.
That's a fine introduction. You're like, oh, hey, your worlds cross for a second and then you're gone. Like, that's fine. But this building up to Scarlet Scarab being, oh, like now she's Scarlet Scarab, like it's not what they give us is not sufficient. So I agree with you. This show feels actually both simultaneously too long because it's 6 hours long and the fundamental story it's trying to tell is quite slight, I think, when it comes to Marvel standards, and too short because they tried to cram in 3 different realities, 3 different people inhabiting this guy's body, and the origin story of Scarlet Scarab. Like, that's why, I think. So
yeah, I can see the movie working, if only because it would force them to streamline this a little bit and remove all the excesses of the script. Although I think that you get like Taika Waititi and Sam Raimi in these Marvel films, and it's just like, again, leaning into that more maximalist filmmaking stuff, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, they have not figured these shows out. And I'm still willing to give them some slack because I know that COVID threw their entire schedule off. And like a lot of these shows were really meant to debut after the films. And I think they were meant to be more of like in between slight content. And then when everything got pushed back, my read is that they felt like these shows needed to do more heavy lifting, and it's not really how they had planned them in the first place, So I'm curious to see, like, as we all get caught back up to the speed of production and typical film scheduling, if that alters their shows. And even comparing it to the first, like, let's say we've had 5 TV shows, by now. And looking at the first like 5 Marvel movies, I think you had probably Iron Man, Captain America that were really strong. And you had like other mixed bags, Incredible Hulk, Thor, Iron Man 2. I think the track record, at least on a TV end of things, is not all that dissimilar. Like, I think most of WandaVision is pretty great. Same with Loki. And then you have a couple of duds here and there. I'm hoping it's a growth prospect for them.
I think they have yet to show they can tell a self-contained story that's really satisfying and or that doesn't just feel like a commercial for the next thing.
Yeah.
Or that doesn't feel like a preview for the next Marvel film.
And Moon Knight was a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and I don't feel like they accomplished that, unfortunately. So, again, there were some great aspects about it, and it's not like it was a complete loss, but I just don't understand what went wrong with this one, Dan, because a show like Loki, spoilers for Loki, but we got to the end of Loki and half of the entire final episode was basically, here's exposition so you know what happens for the next Marvel film in which this is relevant.
Right.
And it's like, wow, was that unsatisfying? Maybe we were kinder to it when we talked about it on this channel, but like,
I just love the performance and the concepts behind it. It's like one of those things in a vacuum. It's cool. Like, my wife fell off Loki and I was like, we should really go just watch this scene, because I think you'll think it's cool. And rewatching it, I was like, I do love this Kang stuff, but
you understand that, like, it's like, hey, we got to the end and we're just explaining what is going to be relevant for the next thing. It's not oh, Kang, this guy you've never met before, is like a particularly satisfying closure for that story.
And I bring into it more baggage than is probably healthy for an actual review of it.
And I felt like Moon Knight, as you said, was a really great opportunity. Hey, self-contained story. We don't need to connect anything else. And this one suffered from completely different problems. This was not like at the end of this, you meet Kang again, or you meet some other person that's kind of Kang-like. It's like at the end of this one, it's, the problem was it tried to do a little bit too much. And as a result, everything felt very disjointed and random, you know? Scarlet Scarab felt random. The 3 different realities in which one we were supposed to kind of be most attached to felt random in a way that didn't feel super intentional. I don't think this was supposed to be an avant-garde show in particular,
No.
There was something subversive to the idea of, hey, we're going to spend 2 to 3 episodes introducing this reality and then like upend that reality.
Right.
In episode 4, like, hey, everything you watch until now is not real. That's kind of cool. But it feels like the show didn't really have the courage of its convictions.
For me, it all just comes down to writing and design. Like, I just don't think they had a clear vision on who or what this was. And so the results of that are something very confused. And, to your point, like, I think the aspiration was there to be like, this is going to be its own thing. And I want to applaud that. Like, that's the direction they should be going in. And I we'll see what happens with like Miss Marvel and She-Hulk and things like that. If they get to kind of live in their own space. I have heard not great things from behind the scenes, but I don't know, man. I don't know.
If you don't think that most of the events of the show were inside this guy's head and he's actually in a sort of asylum, right? Then what was the purpose of the hospital situation, in your opinion? Like, what was going on there? Was it
I honestly don't know. Like it like the whole, every time it came on screen, I was like, I don't know where I'm supposed to be right now.
Was it like maybe it was like a reality that Harrow conjured to like keep him trapped somehow? I don't know.
I'm really unclear about it, because like even the end of the show with the blood from his shoe prints, I was like, that was a moment where I think I was supposed to be having like a aha moment, but I didn't know what that meant. So I was like, and You know, like in a really not good way. I couldn't place how I was supposed to feel about it. And, you know, like I don't know that I completely agree that like this was so inconsequential, because like there is essentially a character arc here. I think that like this Mark character, like when he's given the opportunity to kill Harrow, chooses to relinquish, you know, his violent ways in the past. I don't know how earned that is. You
Yeah,
know,
I mean, by that point, I think you're supposed to feel like, oh my gosh, this guy has made progress. But at that point, the show has thrown so many different realities at you, and like, oh, all of a sudden, Mark is alive. Like Khonshu goes into Mark's body, I guess, and then he comes back to life. I'm like, okay, I guess that's a thing that's going on. You know, like
yeah.
it's thrown so many random things at you that I'm just like, okay, fine. That's another thing that happened. Is Mark decided not to kill Amit in, you know, Harrow's body, you know?
And the philosophical like argument between, you know, Amit and Khonshu, I never felt was reflected in their avatars. You know, this whole idea
Mhm.
of like, you know, uh premeditated or whatever. It's like it's the Minority Report versus
Yes. Amit
standard
is into
policing.
Minority Report, you
Yes.
know, and then Khonshu is like, no, wait until they do the bad thing, then kill them.
Right, but like how is that reflected in the, it should be a struggle for Mark and Steven to make that choice, right? Like, and I think you have like two pretty good like, you know, sides of a personality that can maybe have that argument. You know, maybe you cast Steven as the more reactionary guy, and Mark is the mercenary that,
Mhm.
like, you know, is sent out to kill innocent people, and needs to reflect that actually Khonshu's, you
Right.
know,
Well, I
there's
also just
yeah.
don't find it a particularly compelling, like there's a moment where Amit says, you know, you and I are actually a lot more alike than you think. And it's like, yeah, you kind of are. Like you're both for killing people who do bad things, and then one of you believes that you should do it before they do the bad things, and the other one believes you should do it. Now, there's a lot of questions about predestination and like,
Yeah.
if you know you're going to do the bad thing, does it mean you have to do the bad thing? But the show is not interested in exploring any of that. You know?
No, like maybe there's predestination in Egyptian culture that we could have leaned into, and but it's just trying to appeal to
Yeah.
so many different aspects of the superhero myth at the same time,
Yeah.
that like we never get into any of that. And you've got this big kaiju battle at the end in Egypt. I don't know if people are actually being hurt in that or not. Like, are you know, and like, is it actually like a war of the avatars? It doesn't seem to be. Like, they seem to be independently functioning. If someone makes a really good philosophical point, does it alter the like it's so also disconnected. It's like, why even bother, you know?
But it's okay, Dan, because at the end we get introduced to Jake Lockley riding around in this sweet, sweet ride.
Yeah. Which
So
I'm also unclear about, like the finances of that, but that just might be my comics thing. Because in the comics, Stephen Grant is actually like the billionaire.
mhm. As
And
opposed to working in a gift shop.
right, exactly. And I like that. I thought that was kind of an interesting way to tie it a little bit more to Egyptian myth and things like that. But I don't mind when they change stuff up. Like, I thought the depiction of Mr. Knight here was kind of interesting as this kind of goofy version of Stephen Grant's like Moon Knight personality. Like, cool. That's a complete reinvention of that character. If they sold me on it, I would have gone with it much more. I didn't really get how that functioned, but fair enough.
All right.
So
Well, at the end of the day, it sounds like Moon Knight kind of a disappointment for both you and me. Some great things. Overall, not a show we found particularly satisfying or even comprehensible to some degree.
yeah,
Dan Gvozden is the co-creator and co-host of the Amazing Spider Talk podcast at amazingspidertalk.com. Dan, been a while since we've done one of these, but this was a lot of fun, man. Thanks for joining me.
yeah, this was great, and I'm excited to talk with you on the film cast about Doctor Strange.
tune in to the Filmcast podcast for that. All right, that's going to do it for us here on the channel. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Again, be sure to hit like or subscribe if you did. Be sure to check out Dan's work at the Amazing Spider Talk podcast at amazingspidertalk.com. Link below in the show notes. Thanks also to my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen. Sign up there for exclusive audio as well as access to my office hours. Thank you so much to all the patrons for making my work possible, for making this YouTube channel possible. We'll see you in the next one.